Welcome everyone. Thank you for showing up today. I have a few announcements to make. So Mr. Dwoskin will be here, but some of it will be on Zoom and some will be in person. So in person will be today, October 1st, October 8th, and October 22nd. He will be on Zoom only on October 15th and October 29th. So he won't be in person for those 2 dates. He'll just be on Zoom. Yes. And also, we have cote-saint-luc meets this Thursday. You need to register for the program. It starts at 6:30. We'll have some live jazz music starting at 6:30. We'll also have some goodies. There's still places left, so if you want to register for the program, you can either do it in person or you can do it through reference if you don't know how to do it. And on October 9th, we have Daniel J. Leviton. He'll be there on October 9th. So please turn off your phones and be respectful of other people that might want to hear what Mr. Dwoskin has to say. And also, please keep your walkers away from the walkways for safety reasons. Thank you, and here's Mr. Dwoskin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is for me to be back here in person. The schedule didn't really work out for me that well because I was here all summer long, and now as of the beginning of November or end of October, I'm traveling like I often do. So it is what it is. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy to see all of you, especially St. Francis over there sitting right there. Anyway, I picked a good subject for today because it's an obvious one. And before I get to it, I have to say, there was 2 nights ago, was it 2 nights ago or last night? Mr. Bennett, the ex-Prime Minister of Israel, was here in Montreal giving a talk. Did anybody go to that talk? Just by, there were about 400 people there at the Gelber Center. And this is a man who was the Prime Minister of Israel for too short a time. He was engineered out of power by the supreme skill of Mr. Netanyahu, who bribed two of Mr. Bennett's members of the Knesset to quit Mr. Bennett's party and join the Likud party of Mr. Netanyahu. And when those 2 people left, the majority that Mr. Bennett had of 61 out of 120 went down to 59 out of 120. And as we all can calculate, 59 out of 120 is not half. And so his government fell. Mr. Netanyahu made good on his bribes. He gave important posts to the 2 members of Mr. Bennett's own party who quit Mr. Bennett's government, and they are now prominent members of the Likud cabinet. So for Mr. Netanyahu, it succeeded. For Israel, it was a disaster because Mr. Bennett's speech yesterday, wasn't last night, it was 2 nights ago. Mr. Bennett, his speech last night was extremely strong in condemning Mr. Netanyahu and his government. He called Mr. Netanyahu's government the worst government in Israeli history. And the massive failures of October the 7th, Mr. Bennett laid right at Mr. Netanyahu's feet. He said it's all his fault. He said that the war is almost 1 year long without any real success of any kind, not defeating Hamas and not freeing the hostages. This war of 1 year has been a total failure for Israel. It's caused Israel to lose diplomatic status. It's brought the International Court of Justice down on Israel. It's caused Israel's economy to undergo a tremendous loss, a loss in the balance of payments. In other words, Israel is now spending far more money than it's collecting, so its debt is going up and up and up. The value of its currency has gone down. Two major bond rating agencies, Moody's and Fitch, have downgraded Israel's debt, meaning that it's more expensive for Israel to borrow money. The tourism sector is pretty well finished. Airlines have stopped flying to Israel. I just saw Lufthansa suspended flights this week, along with their friends. The people, the unity in the country, which existed for a brief time after the massacres of October 7th, that unity has disappeared. And the same divisions that were in the country before the October 7th massacre are back again. The divisions over recruitment of ultra-Orthodox people into the military, which Mr. Netanyahu has tried his hardest to prevent, and the judicial reforms, taking power away from the Supreme Court and giving it to the government. Mr. Netanyahu promised that during the war he would not try to do that, but of course he lies, and they're trying to do that again. So it was a wholesale condemnation of the government of Israel, but at the same time it was a speech reflecting the strength of the people of Israel, and that was very impressive. He was asked by interviewers, what would you do differently? Like, how would you handle the situation? What ideas would you have? And what he said is, if you look at all of Israel's wars since 1948, they've all been very short, very sharp, and of course victorious. And this one that Mr. Netanyahu is carrying out is not short and not victorious. So what he said is that he would sort of go into Gaza with maximum amount of power for the shortest amount of time. And if he didn't succeed in the goals he wanted, he said he would make a deal with Hamas to release the hostages, no matter what it costs. Because to keep on something like this is just like a war of attrition, which is costing Israel money and lives every day. Now, as far as the war in Lebanon is concerned, what he said there is, again, he would go in even with troops into Lebanon. He would repeat the result of the war of 2006, where Israel took territory and kept it for a while, using that as a buffer zone. And he said, although Israel withdrew the last time from Lebanon, from the buffer zone that they were running for something like almost 15 years, that he would try the same thing again. And maybe the results would be different this time. I don't see the logic of it, but that's what he was saying. Well, what I just wanted to impress on you before I change subjects is that Mr. Bennett himself looked to me and to everybody else in that room like a candidate for Prime Minister's job. He wasn't giving an academic speech. He wasn't a professor talking about on this hand and on that hand. He wasn't a retired general or a retired politician saying, in my day, I would have done this and I would have done that. He was sitting there saying, I could do a better job than Mr. Netanyahu. And he was asked, so are you going to declare your intentions to run for Prime Minister here in Montreal? And he said, well, wait and see, something like that. So it looks to me like he's a person who wants to be a Prime Minister again. And polls in Israel show that if he ran, he would actually get elected as Prime Minister. He also brought up an interesting fact that some people may not know, is that he lived in Montreal for 2 years when he was a child. And he was brought here by his parents. His father was a delegate of Israel in Montreal, Shaliach. And they were a completely secular family. And because his parents wanted him to go to Hebrew school, they sent him to some kind of an Orthodox sort of kindergarten, and that's where he learned about Jewish holidays, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, which he made part of his life later on. So Montreal, although he doesn't remember it because he was 3 or 4 years old, it played an important part in his whole development. Anyway, like I say, you know, this is a subject to be followed up on. Elections in Israel are not due until October 2026 if the government holds together. And, you know, considering Israeli governments don't often hold for a whole term, you know, we may be having elections sooner than later in that country. So that's that. What I did want to speak about, though, is Israel's neighbor, Lebanon. So we all know there's a war going on there. We all know that the Hezbollah militia has attacked Israel since October 7th. We know that Israel has evacuated 70,000 residents from the northern borders of Israel because of the fear of rocket attacks coming in and destroying their houses, their lives, their schools, etc. These 70,000 people are now scattered around the country, waiting to come home, away from their jobs, away from their businesses. And, you know, that's another sort of ill effect of the attack of October 7th. But I'm not going to talk about what's happening today. I'd like to speak about Lebanon itself as a country, just to give you an idea of what a special place it is on the one hand, and what a horrible present that country is living through on the other. So let's do that. So here's a map. Lebanon only has two neighbors, only two, which is again unusual for a country. It has Israel on the south, and it has Syria on the north, and it has Syria on the east, and it has the Mediterranean Ocean on the west. So it is a country exactly to the north of Israel. It's smaller than Israel. Israel is a small place. You can drive from one end of the country to the other easily in a day. But Lebanon is even smaller than Israel. So it's not that big. It has at present 5 million people. Israel has about 10 million people. Syria used to have 24 million people. So in terms of its neighbors, it's geographically smaller, and its size, the population is smaller as well. So let's just look back. Well, let's start like this. The country is called Lebanon. The name Lebanon is mentioned 70 times. 70 times in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. So definitely it was a known place even in ancient times. The Bible recounts that the King Solomon bought wood from the king of Lebanon to build his temple. So that's how far back trade goes. The Phoenicians were people who lived here first, you know, in historical times. And the Phoenicians were phenomenal seafaring people. The Phoenicians had colonies all the way as far as Spain and Tunisia and Morocco. The Phoenicians went all the way on both sides of the Mediterranean, trading in Mediterranean goods from one place to another. So they were a power that challenged Rome. And Rome and Phoenicia fought a battle in 146 BC, and that battle was in Phoenicia's big city called Carthage, which is now Tunis, and the Phoenicians were defeated in that battle. So it goes to show how far they spread. They were, you know, from Lebanon, their heartland went all the way across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians contributed a lot to civilization, and their biggest contribution was the alphabet. So the alphabet that we use today comes directly from them. Now, the Phoenicians spoke a Semitic language. In other words, a language closely related to Hebrew. And they used letters, the alphabet that they used is the same as the Hebrew alphabet, written in the old style. In other words, in the style that Hebrew used to be written in before he would change the alphabet to today's alphabet. So many of you probably know or have seen pictures of the old Hebrew alphabet, and very old artifacts that are found in Israel are written in that old alphabet. But that was also the Phoenician alphabet. And the Phoenician alphabet spread it all around the world. They spread it to the Greeks spread it to the Romans spread it to us. So that's how the alphabet started. Of course, it was a phenomenal invention. It may have been invented in the Sinai. So it was that those letters were used all around the world, including in Israel. But it was the Phoenicians who spread it, who used it and spread it. Now, the history of Phoenicia and Lebanon is the same basically as the history of Israel. Let's get to the word Lebanon itself. Where do you think that the name comes from? You say? Lavan, right? What does Lavan mean? White, right? So Lebanon is a yogurt, right? A white colored yogurt. And the name Lebanon was invented because of the snow-capped mountains in Lebanon. So Lebanon has snow every winter, which Israel doesn't have necessarily. And especially, in days, say 4,000 years ago, the climate there was not as hot as it is today. And they had plenty of snow. And the snow was so impressive that the people called their country Lebanon, which comes from Lavan, which is white. And that's the origin of the country. So the name has been around for a long time. Even the Egyptian pharaohs referred to Lebanon as Lebanon. So that, the name has been there for a long time. All the other waves of conquest that passed through the Middle East and passed through Israel, of course, passed through Lebanon as well. So the Persians were in control, the Greeks were in control, the Romans were in control, and lastly, the Byzantine Christians were in control, and then the Arabs were in control, and then the Ottoman Turks were in control. So, summing up roughly 2,700 years of history, that's the waves that passed through Lebanon, the same as it passed through Israel. Now, some of the cities in Lebanon, there's actually 3 cities in the Middle East: Byblos in Lebanon, Damascus in Syria, and Jerusalem in Israel, which have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. There were always people living there in those cities, going back 3,500 years ago, or in the case of Byblos, maybe 5,000 years ago. So, this location on the Mediterranean, at the end of the Mediterranean, was a key place. And Beirut, the capital city, Beirut is over here. It's a beautiful port, so they have a nice natural harbor. And, this was a center of trade, of commerce, of transfer of ideas from east to west, from Persia, from India to Greece and Rome, and all the way also from Europe all the way down into the Middle East and into Africa. So, this is a crossroads of the world, whether it's Israel or Lebanon, it's the same location and the same strategic advantages. So let's talk about a little bit about what makes this place unique. What's so special about it? Well, one of the things that's special about it is that when Christianity came to the Middle East, in the 300s, it was declared as the official religion of the Roman Empire. the people of Lebanon really got converted to Christianity in a big way. And there was a monk in the 4th century, 4th and 5th century, a monk, who had a kind of stream of Christianity that was very ascetic and very monk-like. In other words, all kinds of ideas. When Christianity formed, there were many different streams that were all forming at the same time, discussing what the nature of Jesus was. Was Jesus a real person? Was Jesus a God on earth and never a real person? There were all kinds of conflicts revolving around the nature of Jesus himself. And this monk said, in order for us to sort of communicate with God, we have to separate ourselves from society. We have to go up in the mountains. We have to live a simple life. And this kind of monasticism was not only found there in Lebanon, but in Egypt, and in Syria, and other places where these ideas were there to try to copy the life of Jesus in people's own times. They simply not, fighting for the last dollar and this type of thing. So he went up into the mountains of Lebanon. His name was Maron, M-A-R-O-N. And the Maronite people today, the Maronite Christians, are named after him. What was so unusual about this guy is that he proclaimed his loyalty to the Pope in Rome. And there was a division in Christianity, as you may know, when the Roman Empire fell apart. There was an east part and a west part. The west part was in Rome, and the east part was in Istanbul. And similarly, the people who were Christians kind of divided themselves into Western Christians who were Catholics and Eastern Christians who were Orthodox. The formal split was in the year 1052, but they were split long before then. So the difference is that in general, by the way, the differences are that the Pope was the head of the Catholic Church in Rome, but a different Pope was the head of the Orthodox Church in Constantinople. The other differences are that the Christians in Rome used Latin as their language of prayer, and the Christians in the East used Greek and all other languages that were belonging to the people around there. So Bulgarian or Romanian or Russian or Ukrainian. So they used the local languages, but the Pope in Rome used Latin as their language. Now this guy, Maron, he was loyal to the Pope in Rome. So separately from all the other Christians all around who were more loyal to the Orthodox faith based in Istanbul. Now, so that's an important factor later on, as we'll come to see. Let's come now to the Crusades. You've all heard about them. What was the idea of the Crusades? Anybody give me a quick reminder? Why did the Crusaders crusade? What was their goal? Religion, yeah, but where did the Crusades start? Where did they start? Where did they come from, the Crusaders? France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, mostly France, Germany. And their goal was to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. The Muslims had captured Jerusalem in the 600s, in 640. Sweeping up from Saudi Arabia, they ended up capturing the whole Middle East. By the 600s, they were in charge of everywhere from here to Iraq, from Arabia to Iraq on one side. And by the 700s, they came all the way across Africa, into Spain, and into France by the 700s. So imagine, within less than 100 years, they went from Saudi Arabia to France on foot. No tanks, no planes, no buses, no nothing. They managed to get that far. And of course, they did capture Jerusalem, and they did capture what we would call today Lebanon. There was a kind of a counterattack by the Christian the Eastern Roman Empire based in Istanbul, but they could not hold off the Arabs in the south, and they were busy fighting with the Persians in the east. So you had this triangular fight between these three different civilizations: the Iranians, the Christians in Istanbul, and the Arabs in the south. And so by the time the Middle Ages rolled around, then all this area was belonging to different Arab empires, one based in Damascus, one based in Baghdad, but the Christians had lost. They just kept on losing until they were finally defeated in Istanbul in 1453. But when the Arabs came up here, they were not able to convert everybody to Islam. A lot of people remained Christian, even though they were ruled by Islam. They remained Christian, and some of the strongest remainers were in Lebanon. And they were not just Catholics in Lebanon, but also Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and lots of other smaller Christian sects, which today have only a handful of people, of a couple of thousand people. So that was the people in Lebanon. Of course, the Christians kind of retreated a little bit inland and into the mountains, and the Muslims were able to control the coastline of what became Lebanon for the most part. So I was talking about the Crusades. The Crusades started in 1000 and finished in 1200. Their objective was to conquer Jerusalem. But on the way to Jerusalem, they also passed through Lebanon. And the French Crusaders from France met these Maronites who were Catholics in Lebanon, and they formed a close tie. And that tie lasted 800 years. From 1100 to 1900, that tie was always there. So the association, you could say, of Lebanon with France goes back to the Crusades. So now we'll come up to kind of close to now. The Ottoman Turks captured the whole Middle East from the Arabs in the 1500s. And this became a province of Syria. So Syria, with its capital of Damascus, controlled what we would call today Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. That was all one big province of Syria. And the way the Ottomans worked was they left people alone. They said, okay, we are here to rule this country, we're here to collect taxes, but we're not here to interfere in the daily lives of the people, in their religions, beliefs, organizations, schools, etc. So they allowed every community to run their own affairs, including all the Jews who lived in the Ottoman Empire, including all the Christians who lived in the Ottoman Empire. So long as you paid taxes and were loyal to the Sultan, you could do pretty well whatever you wanted. It was a very light touch that they had on their territories. And so what happened was that the Ottoman Empire started to lose power by the 1800s. They lost territories to Russia, they lost territories in Europe, Greece became independent, and France went to the Ottoman Empire and said, look, we want to protect the Christians living in Lebanon. So what we want you to do is to create a separate, we'll call it not a province, but something like a province, a district that would be taken out of Syria and moved to its own provincial status in Lebanon. And the Ottomans agreed because they kind of had no choice. And this was done in the 1860s. And that was done. Comes the First World War. the Ottoman Empire loses the war. And the victorious powers, who were France and Britain, and the US, they ended up taking over, France and Britain ended up taking over the Ottoman territory. So we all know about the mandate for Palestine, right? At the end of the war, First World War, Great Britain got a mandate to rule Palestine for 50 years, and in Palestine to create a Jewish national home. But that wasn't the only mandate. There were lots of other mandates that were given up. South Africa got a mandate to run the former German colonies in South Africa, what we would call today Namibia. Great Britain got a mandate to rule German East Africa, which is now called Tanzania. France got a mandate to run Syria and Lebanon. And so all of these mandates were given out by the United Nations to the victorious countries in the First World War. And Germany lost everything. Ottoman Empire was completely broken up. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was completely broken up. So the whole world was transformed after the First World War. So what happened in Lebanon? In 1920, a territory was created called Grand Liban, or Big Lebanon. And why did they call it Grand? Is because they took the territories that the Christians were living in, which is where my hand is, and they expanded it to make it bigger so that it would be like a bigger place, and would also include Christians living in scattered places here and there all around. So this became Grand Liban, ruled by France, and it became a prosperous place after the First World War was over. Business people came in, tourism came in. It was the cultural capital of the Arab world. It was the publishing center of the Arab world. It was the film center of the Arab world. It was the business center of the Arab world. Banks, insurance companies, trading companies were all based in Beirut because they had good contacts with the Arab world all around, and they were part of the French world as well. So they had all the contacts in France and in all the other French colonies going all the way down. But before, I'm going to go backwards a little bit now. So in the late 1800s, I was saying the Ottoman Empire was in a bad shape, right? The economy was really down, and a lot of people left Lebanon. They emigrated, they moved out. Where did they move to? South America, Central America, North America, Africa. The Ivory Coast has 100,000 Lebanese people living there. Senegal has 30,000 Lebanese people living there. Central and South America, there's millions of Lebanese people living in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Chile. Pretty well every South American and Central American country has a huge Lebanese community, as we did here too, in Montreal, in Canada. Thousands of Lebanese people moved here. Do any of you remember the building on Jean Talon near St. Lawrence called the Syrian Lebanese Club? It was, remember that building? That building was there as a cultural center for Syrian and Lebanese Christians. So the people who left Lebanon were mainly Christians. And the reason for that is because they were the ones who had the international connections. They were the ones who had families already abroad. They were the ones who had a little more, let's say, worldly look on things. They may have spoken other languages besides Arabic. And so when the opportunity presented itself, they moved. Just as, lots of other people moved out as well. So the fact is that there are more Lebanese today living outside of Lebanon than inside of Remember we had in Quebec the Malouf report on, was not long ago on government waste and stuff like that. So that Malouf family is one of these Lebanese immigrants. The Khoury family, who had all kinds of businesses, is another one. The Rossi family, I believe, from Dollarama and Rossi stores, they're another one. There's untold amounts of Lebanese Christian business people in Montreal who came here 100 years ago. And it was the same wave that sent them all over the place. And when they got to Africa, they did super well because they're the ones who spoke French. They're the ones who had contacts with France. They were the ones who could be the buyers of coffee, the buyers of cocoa, the buyers of gold, and the traders who traded goods produced in Africa and sent them to France, and they imported stuff from France and sold it in Africa. So they had a really big job there in Africa itself. So that was the immigration from Lebanon. And in 1932, so Lebanon was already a separate territory run by France, but given a lot of autonomy. They had a census in Lebanon to count the people. They counted 55% Christians and 45% Muslims in the 1932 census. But there are 18 official religions recognized in Lebanon. There's 5 different Muslim sects, and there's maybe 10 different Christian sects, and the Jewish community there, which is officially recognized as an official religion of the country as well. And these people were living sort of scattered all over the place. It's not that you could divide a line and say this part is Muslim and this part is Christian. The Christians were centered from Beirut to the north a little bit, but scattered all over the place. And the Sunni Muslims were located in the north part of the country, and the Shiite Muslims were located in the south part here, and along the east part over here, and a little bit in the corner up there. So you had people living mixed with each other, but areas where each of the main groups predominated. So the main groups would be the Shiites in the south, and the Sunni Muslims in the north, and the Christians kind of in a big place like this, and also the Druze community mixed in here along in the south part. So the Druze community have been living in Lebanon since the beginning of the Druze religion. The Druze religion was formed as an offshoot of Shiite Islam in the 1100s. So they live in Lebanon, they live in Israel, and most of them live in Syria. So within a pretty close range of each other in the olden days, before these boundaries were created, they were living, quite close to each other in these territories over here. But the vast majority of the Druze people live in Syria, but in South Syria. So not that far from here, like just where my hand is over here. And then the Druze live on the southeast of Beirut here, and in the northern parts of Israel over there. So that's one of the communities, besides the Shiites and the Sunnis. And then among the Christians, like I said, there's so many different divisions. Some of them live in villages, some of them live in towns, some of them live all over the place. There's also an Armenian community who were refugees from the 1915 massacre of Armenians who managed to escape or walk through the desert and ended up in Lebanon, and they settled down over there. And also what's interesting in Lebanon is that before the Arabs came, in the 600s, what language was the one that was spoken in the country? Do you think? As in Israel, Aramaic, right? Aramaic was the common language of the Middle East, from Iraq to Syria to Israel to Lebanon. And when the Arabs came, they replaced Aramaic with Arabic. But that replacement among the Christians was slow. So there are today still, among the Syrian Orthodox community, their church services are in Aramaic language. And there were two villages before the Lebanese Civil War, which I'll come to, that still spoke Aramaic even into modern times in those two places. And they're trying to revive it in one village in Israel, where the people traditionally spoke Aramaic again until modern times. Okay. So now let's come to the 1900s. And of course, I'll have lots of time for questions and comments and things like that. But why not learn about the place that is in the news all the time? Fine. Doesn't matter. The Second World War, when it came, was really a catalyst for Lebanese independence, because, as you know, France was captured by Germany. They set up a Vichy regime in France, and also, I'm telling you all this so that you kind of get the idea that one thing is connected to another. That the whole world, in a certain sense, has got one interweaving kind of system, where what happens in one place, even far away, can affect what happens in another place eventually. So the Second World War broke out in Europe. The Germans captured France, and that means that in France, all the colonies that belonged to France became sort of ruled by the French regime loyal to the Nazis, the Pétain regime, the Vichy regime. But the Vichy regime was based in Paris. This is far away. Now, there was a government that escaped France, led by Charles de Gaulle, who went to England, and he said, I'm the official leader of France, and don't believe anything that the Vichy tells you. And what he did was he tried to take over Lebanon under his forces, helped by the British, because the British were afraid that if the Germans ever got to Lebanon, they would be next door to Iraq, where all the oil was. And so what happened was that the Free French forces came into Lebanon. They allowed Lebanon to become an independent country, because that way, it wouldn't be like France still has a claim on Lebanon if Lebanon is free. So Lebanon became independent in 1943. The system of a religion defining the country was established, so that the president had to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister had to be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the House of Parliament had to be a Shiite Muslim. And so that kind of division spread itself throughout the whole civil service, ambassadors, cabinet ministers, you name it, everything is divided up like that according to religion. In 1946, when the war was over, the last French forces left Lebanon. So Lebanon effectively became independent in 1946, just like Israel in 1948. And then, of course, in 1948, when Israel declared its independence, there was a war, and all of Israel's neighbors attacked Israel, but not really Lebanon. Lebanon had a few sort of irregular forces that went across the border to try to attack Israel, just like Syria did, like Jordan did, like Egypt did. But there wasn't much fighting, and the border remained the international border at the end of 1948. But what did happen was Palestinian refugees who were left Israel, 100,000 of them went to Lebanon because it was close. Refugees from Haifa, refugees from all of northern Israel ended up in refugee camps in Sidon, Tyre, and Beirut. And these people were looked after by the United Nations, like all the other refugees went to other places. So those 400,000 Palestinian refugees are today somewhere close to 300 to 400,000 descendants of these refugees. The Lebanese government never gave them citizenship. The Lebanese government said there are 70 professions that they're not allowed to practice in order to prevent competition with native Lebanese people. The fiction was, of course, that these people are going to go back to Palestine anyway, so we don't have to give them citizenship, and we don't have to give them money, and we don't have to look after them, because that's the United Nations' responsibility. So these Palestinians and their descendants have been living in Lebanon since 1940. Now we're going to skip over to 1970. In 1970, well, 1967 was the Six-Day War, of course. Israel captured what it captured. And Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, he moved to Jordan to try to, get his forces together to fight against Israel. But what happened in 1970 was that he tried to overthrow King Hussein. He tried to actually take over Jordan for the Palestinians. And he lost. And King Hussein kicked him and all his followers with their weapons out of the country. So where did they go? They went to Lebanon, because Lebanon was not strong enough to say no. They established themselves all of a sudden in Lebanon. And that influx of weapons and people changed the distribution or the balance between the Christians and the Muslims in Lebanon. And it was always felt, not incorrectly, that many of the Christians in Lebanon, including the Maronite Christians, who were the biggest sect of Christians, that they were more friendly to Israel than anybody else. And if they had their way, Lebanon would be having relations with Israel just like many other countries have relations. But when Arafat and his gang came with all those weapons, they kind of mobilized the Muslims to turn against the Christians. And the civil war broke out in Lebanon in 1975 and lasted until 1990. So they had a civil war off and on for 15 years, which pretty well destroyed the country. It chased all the money out of the country. It just physically destroyed a lot of the country. It put it's simple to say it was Christians against Muslims, but there were also Christians fighting each other, and there were also Muslims fighting each other in that civil war. It was a complicated civil war. But it destroyed the country, and it only ended. Well, while the civil war was going on, Hezbollah, this armed Shiite group, was created in order to fight the civil war. And Israel intervened in the middle of the civil war in the 1980s, because they said, look, we're being attacked over the border, just like they were now. There's a civil war going in Lebanon. What we could do is try to kill two birds with one stone. The two birds were to move into Lebanon and break up the Hezbollah. The second stone was to install a government in Beirut that would be friendly to Israel. And they had a candidate who would do that. One of the Maronite Christians from the most important families in Lebanon was named president, backed by Israel. And Israel's idea was that, of course, Lebanon would now make peace with Israel, and that would be that. This man, Mr. Jamal, was assassinated pretty quick after his installation. Israel had backed militias who ended up massacring Palestinians in Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. And Israel started to look at itself and say, hey, we got into a mess. We got into a quagmire that we didn't realize that we bit off more than we could chew. And so what they did was Israel withdrew from Lebanon, but they kept a kind of a buffer zone all the way along the border that was about 10 kilometers wide. And they said, we're going to stay here. we're not leaving this part, we're staying right here. And they recruited local Christian militias to run that place for Israel. This little strip of land over here like this. Now, when the civil war ended in Lebanon, well, it ended why? Because Syria invaded, Syrian troops came in, they came into Beirut, and what the Syrians did was they took everything that wasn't nailed down. So as bad as the country was destroyed beforehand, the Syrians took anything of value that was left and stole it. So the country was really on its down and outside by the end of the Civil War in 1995. One of the conditions of the ending of that war was all the militias had to be disarmed. So each militia, and there were like Sunni militias, there were Shiite militias, there were Christian militias, there were dozens of them. Mostly they were almost like gangs. They were like almost like street gangs, you could call them. But they had their own flags and their own slogans and all that kind of stuff. And they were all disarmed, except for Hezbollah. Hezbollah was allowed to keep all its weapons because they were the ones who said, we are going to get Israel out of this strip over here. We're going to confront Israel. We have to have our weapons to defend southern Lebanon and to defend the Shiite community from the Israelis. So they were allowed to keep all their weapons. And they were the only militia who was allowed to do that. Otherwise, it was the Lebanese army who had the monopoly of force in the country. Now, what happened was the Hezbollah started a kind of a war of attrition against Israel in the south. And eventually Israel said, you know what, it's not worth it. Keeping this territory is not doing us any good. We're losing soldiers. We want to make a deal whereby the United Nations would come in and patrol southern Lebanon. Hezbollah would be disarmed. And on those conditions, we're going to leave southern Lebanon. And that's what they did. They agreed to do that. It was in the 2000s, between 2000 and 2010. But of course, Hezbollah never got disarmed. The United Nations did send some forces there to so-called watch the border. And that was that. So Hezbollah has always been, since then, a force in southern Lebanon to confront against Israel. Now, since then, the civil war ended, and the people of Lebanon got tired of the Syrian administration. And there was a politician who came from Saudi Arabia, a multi-millionaire who made his money in Saudi Arabia. He came back to Lebanon and said, I want to rule this country and bring it back into Lebanese hands. What happened to him? His car blew up in a massive fireball in Beirut. And the fact that they assassinated him with such sort of openness led to the Lebanese people to demand that the Syrians get out of the country, which they did. So that's finally how the Syrians got out, because they were forced out by public pressure. And so the Syrians left Lebanon. But Lebanon was a shell. The Lebanon, which was the Paris of the Middle East, the Switzerland of the Middle East, ended up becoming a Haiti of the Middle East. The money in Lebanon was devalued by 95%. 80% of the people are living in poverty. People left the country wherever they could. But then in 2011, 2012, a new civil war broke up in Syria. Remember that one, right? The Assad civil war, which is technically still not even finished today. 1 million refugees came from Syria into Lebanon in that war. So the Lebanese people left as a result of the Lebanese civil war, and Syrian refugees came in as a result of the Syrian civil war. So Lebanon still has its 5 million people, but they're not the same ones as were there, you know, back in the 20th century. But these people, these Syrian refugees, have no money, have no resources, and the country is, you know, really down. There was a huge explosion in Beirut harbor, right? You remember that? Fertilizer was supposedly stored by the Hezbollah in an unsafe way. It blew up, and half of the port of Lebanon, of Beirut, was blown up, and another blow to the country. So the political situation is there that Lebanon is regarded as the second most democratic country in the Middle East after Israel, right? So they still have elections, they still have freedoms to vote, they have an enormous amount of corruption. So what has often happened is that the big family bosses, whether they're Christians or Muslims, they would get together to form a government. And in that government, they would use it to steal money or give themselves monopolies over the lives of the people. And so Lebanon never had a chance to sort of prosper, even though it has this sort of democratic system. The electricity distribution system of Lebanon is all in private hands. There's no state electricity company. So 95% of the people have no electricity from time to time because there's all these small generators who run these little electricity companies. They run out of money to pay their bills, and all of the electricity gets shut off. You know, that's the status of the country now. It's gone from bad to worse, we'll put it like that. The Hezbollah, as far as a political movement is concerned, they are represented in the Lebanese parliament. They, up until quite recently, they had a veto out of anything that passed in the legislature of Lebanon. Hezbollah had to agree to it because they had that many seats. Their seats are the same, but some of their allies lost seats in the last elections, so they're not quite. They don't quite rule the country, you know, per se, but they still are the largest kind of single bloc in the country, in the parliament. So, you know, they are kind of not, you know, ruling Lebanon, but they, you know, they're a strong power in the country. A war broke out between Hezbollah and Israel in 2006. Israel bombed the heck out of southern Lebanon. And a lot of people were saying to the Hezbollah, look, you're causing us all this problem. It's your fault that Israel is bombing us. And the fact that what's going on today is trying to repeat that same lesson. So Israel is trying to tell the Lebanese people, look, it's not our fault that we're bombing you, it's Hezbollah's fault. And some people agree to that, and some people obviously don't agree to that. But the fact is that the misery of Lebanon is just being compounded these days by this new war that's going on, which is an offshoot of the Gaza war. So when the Gaza war broke out, Hezbollah said, we stand beside the Palestinians of Gaza. We are going to attack Israel from the north so that Israel's forces will be divided and they won't be able to concentrate all their forces in Gaza. They'll have to deal with us. And Israel had no choice, of course, but to deal with them. And you heard about that amazing attack by pagers and walkie-talkies that they blew up. You know, Israel is kind of stuck. If they invade physically, then they get sucked into that same idea of occupation. If they don't invade, the Hezbollah forces have far more firepower than Hamas ever had. They have more than 150,000 rockets that are buried, scattered all over the place in southern Lebanon. And Israel is fighting a war on two fronts at this point. And Iran is the backer of Hezbollah. So remember, Iran is the largest Shiite country in the world. Their brand of Islam was always one that was kind of looked down on by the vast majority of Muslims. And there are Shiite communities in Syria, Shiite communities in Lebanon, Shiite communities in Yemen, and of course in Iraq. And when the Iranian Revolution happened, under the Ayatollahs, they said, our job is to protect Shiites wherever they are. And that's why there's such a close relation between the Shiites of Lebanon and the Iranian regime. So that explains that. So Iran could now get sucked into this war as well by protecting the Hezbollah who are fighting a war with Israel. So, you know what? We're just about done. So this gives you a kind of a brief look at Lebanon. Let me just talk to you just a little bit about how the beauty of the country is. It's to the north of Israel, so it means it gets more rain than Israel gets. It had traditionally these forests called the cedars of Lebanon, these big trees that were the ones that King Solomon bought. Today, there's more cedars of Lebanon outside of Lebanon than inside of Lebanon because they've all been cut down. Of all the Arab countries, it has the most arable land because of the climate. It's got the most agricultural product. And traditionally, Lebanon was producing all kinds of agricultural fruits and vegetables for the whole Middle East. Still today, if you go to Adonis, you look for canned figs or canned peaches or canned apricots or jams, you'll see it coming from Lebanon to this day. But it's a country that is really, really down. And it used to be said that Lebanon would be the second country to recognize Israel, the second Arab country to recognize Israel, because they were too small and too weak to do it on their own. But once one country did it, they would jump in. And today Israel has, relations with Egypt, with Jordan, with Morocco, with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain. But because of Hezbollah, Lebanon cannot recognize Israel and make peace. Even though if they did, it would be a phenomenal deal for both of them. Imagine a train going between Haifa and Beirut. It would be like a half-an-hour train. And, there would be tourists on all sides coming to visit each other. So that's about it. Now I'm ready to take comments, questions, but anything you want to ask me about Lebanon or the Middle East or anything else. So just to tell you, like, the second biggest city in Lebanon is called Tripoli. And Tripoli is also the name of the capital of Libya. And that's a port in the north that was also severely affected in the Civil War. There are some wealthy families in Lebanon who were able to shield their money from the banks. There was also a pyramid scheme. There was a Lebanese banking pyramid scheme whereby people were encouraged to put their money in banks that promised them high interest. And then, of course, when everyone wanted their money back, nobody could get their money back and everything failed. So that was another source of great loss in the country. So it's really, it has had a string of bad luck, we'll call it, or bad fortune, ever since the glory days of the 1930s. 1930s and 40s were the best years of the country, and maybe the 50s. After that, things went down. Has anyone ever been to Lebanon? Any of you people? No. It's not high on the tourist list these days, I can say that. But one day. Okay, questions, comments, anything like that? Take your time. Yes. Danny Thomas, many people have Lebanese background. Many people. I think the current mayor of town of Mount Royal, I think she's the Lebanese Lakwe. I mean, you know, there's such an industrious community, a community which, like I said, spread all around the world, that today the biggest source of money coming into Lebanon is actually money sent by Lebanese living outside of Lebanon. Remittances, it's called. And remittances are a source of income, you know, from many countries. India, Mexico, places like that have all of their foreign people living abroad sending money home. Lebanon is in the same situation. Yeah. Yes, yeah. There wasn't a huge community there, but there was an old community that was there for a very long time. And you're right, many of them did come to Montreal. There's still a small community left. Yasser Arafat once said, "I will protect the synagogue of Beirut, don't worry." You know, it was never as big a community as, let's say, Egypt or Iraq, of course, or even Syria. But there was always a small community. Okay, so listen, thank you all so much for coming. It's such a pleasure for me to see you all. I think I probably recognize about 80% of you because you've been coming to my classes since the 1970s. And I've gotten older as you have, so we've gotten older together. I'm actually going in November, I'm doing a trip to Egypt. So I will find out what's going on over there. And because, you know, we love to travel, I was just in Italy doing a bike trip a week ago, I just got that. So thank you all for coming. Tell your friends, and I'll see you next Tuesday.